Tring's distinctly middle class.
Yeah, I do like Tring.
Tring's distinctly...
Fantastic museum.
Fantastic museum.
I did work experience there.
It's just full of dead animals. It's great. I remember going on, like, when I was really young, just going on tours around there. And obviously Rothschild, he killed every single one of them there. But my mum and dad just being like, oh, no. He just kind of found them dead because they wanted to spare my, like, little 8-year-old mind that maybe this guy who I thought was really cool because he had all these animals, they wanted to spare the thought that he actually went out and killed them for his museum.
Now the Monster Mash. The Monster Mash. And it's a graveyard smash. It's now the mash. It's caught on in a flash. It's now the mash.
Hello and welcome to Joel and Josh's Amazing Creatures,
where we take your fantasies and drag them grotesquely through reality.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Joel.
And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about another Greek myth. Now, last time we were on the Greek Factor, we were talking about griffins, but this time we're getting distinctly more lizardy. Hydras. Now, hydras, like mentioned before, are a Greek myth, originally appearing in the 12 trials of Hercules, or Heracles, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure which ones.
Heracles is the Greek, Hercules is the Roman.
Ah, so Hercules is like the bastardized version that the Romans did. Okay, so Heracles then, in which in the second trial he had to go vanquish this Hydra. But he came across a very troubling issue, because every time he cut off one of the Hydra's heads, two grew back in its place. Now, in many different interpretations of the myth, the Hydra's had many different heads to start. But we're not going to really focus on that. We just want to tackle the various aspects of what makes a Hydra and how we can bring that into reality. But we've kind of been pipped to the post a little bit, haven't we?
Yeah, it's quite impractical to have multiple heads.
But the fact that there's a real Hydra already existing,
yes.
So we've been...
They are called Hydra as well, so which is handy if you want to Google them. They're a type of platyhelminth.
And what's a platyhelminth?
It's a flat, unsegmented worm.
A worm. Okay, so that's not quite what we were going for in terms of appearance. So why are they known as Hydras? Is it the whole head thing?
Yes, it is the head thing. Basically, what scientists have done because they get bored or they're very troubled people, they make an incision right down the middle of the head, so they actually physically cut the head in half, and then they've observed what happens afterwards, because it doesn't kill the Hydra, it just grows two heads.
So this worm has the ability to grow two heads, because one thing I was thinking about was this whole idea of growing a head back. I've always thought of like a head as like the start of a being, like because that's what a brain is. We're effectively big meat piles being piloted by a squishy blob.
Yes.
Because there's always been these things like, for example, bring that out of Greek mythology for a while. I'm very much into my comic books, and there are various characters that have healing factors in comic books. For example, Wolverine or Deadpool, for example. And there was this one issue of a comic which I took a bit of an issue with, where they basically said that Wolverine regenerated from a single drop of blood. And the main issue was I'm willing to suspend my disbelief for comic books a lot of the time. You know what? There are people flying around shooting lasers out their eyes. I'm not going to question it because that kind of ruins the immersion. But then my first thought when they said that he regenerated from a drop of blood was, how come every time he's cut, there's not suddenly like 50 other Wolverines running around? Like, it just doesn't make sense. And the way that a lot of writers go about it is they say, you can dice him up however you want, but he will always regrow from the head, and his body will just kind of disintegrate. Like, his head is the starting point. So how does this kind of work with the head? Like, memories and how it works its body. How does it survive with its head being cut in half long enough for it to regenerate?
Well, that's the thing. Nobody's really sure. They're very simple animals. They haven't got a fully complex brain like we do. We don't even know why it is that they retain their memories, but they do retain their memories and this can be experimented on by getting the platyhelminth to associate a particular odour with a food source. And this experiment has been quite effective. For example, have you heard about security bees?
What are security bees?
They're the next step in security dogs, because it takes at least 5 years to train a dog to be a security dog in airports. For bees, it takes 10 minutes.
Okay, explain, because you know, if this is saving the bees, then I'm all for it.
What they do is they put a bee in a box with whatever drug they want the bee to look for, and then they will supply the bee with a massive amount of pollen. The bee will then think, oh hey, there's all this weed, there's all this pollen, I'm going to go and look for all the weed I can.
Ah, so bees can basically be trained to associate drugs with pollen?
Yes.
So that can work with anything like cocaine or meth?
Yeah, cocaine, meth.
What about, someone I know was reading a book recently about someone who worked in customs and all the crazy stuff that they found. There's quite a lot of animal smuggling, so can a bee be trained to associate a parrot with pollen as well, for example?
I imagine it is possible. Like if you get a parrot and ruffle its feathers in all the pollen and then just throw a load of bees on the back. It wouldn't be very good for
Ethics.
especially with endangered animals.
Yeah, of course. But so effectively, they would release a load of bees into the airport.
Yeah.
Okay. Health and safety aside, that's very interesting, and it's like a good. I guess it's like a good step towards like saving the bees because they are becoming dangerously endangered, aren't they? So basically, this flatworm, even though its head's been cut in half or cut off, it will regrow a new head or two heads if it's been cut in half, both retaining the same memories.
Yes.
Because I was genuinely wondering, because you mentioned this before, just in a conversation we had about how the hell would you test a worm's memory, because you can't make it exactly a SATS paper, can you? But if it's associating odours with food, then that makes a hell of a lot of sense. But we've already done an insect dragon, and as much as when I mentioned that worms are insects before, you had a minor freak out.
They're platyhelminths. Well, the ones I'm talking about are platyhelminths, but earthworms are annelids.
Well, what I'm saying is we don't want to make this terrifying Hydra into a worm, because as much as the film Tremors has taught us that worms can be scary, it doesn't exactly feel like we're doing justice to the myth. So what I want to talk about now is the ability to have two heads on a normal creature. Now, there's a condition called polycephaly.
Yes.
Which has been recorded in a number of creatures, from snakes to calves you were talking about.
Yes, this is very recent. Snakes are quite common because people they breed them, and it's very expensive if you're a collector and you want a two-headed snake. Or some people get scaleless snakes, or basically freak snakes. But this is a natural mutation that does sometimes occur because there's it's a kind of gene that just prevents the whole body from going into overload when you're still in the earliest stages of being a blastocyst into just sort of developing stuff too many times. And there's a current calf, I can't remember where I think it's in America, but it was born with two heads, and it was expected to live for no more than 2 days, and 3 months later it's still alive.
So effectively, like, it's mainly caused because of an embryotic mess up, isn't it? Where maybe two embryos fuse, but not quite all the way, similar to conjoined twins.
Yes, sometimes it's when twins are forming, it comes from a single cell that replicates, but it replicates a bit too much. And conjoined twins, they basically just don't separate when they're in those very earliest stages.
In fact, I think there is a girl in America who has two heads. It's a pair of twins, and each head, of course, has their own individual personality, and they can drive, and they can do all sorts, and they're becoming a bit of a TV personality. But you also saying that, like, there are people who want two-headed snakes and purposely breed them.
Yes.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, it's the same way that any kind of artificial selection works. You find an animal with a trait, for example, if you think about how we got from wolves to pugs.
Ah, okay.
And if someone finds the snake that happens to have this mutation, they will try and ensure its survival to adulthood so that it can breed, and they will have it mate with another snake. Interestingly, snakes have two penises, because they mate side to side and they can't roll around.
Ah, so in terms of these two-headed snakes, so I do remember seeing one. It was on a post on a website, and it was actually their owner talking about it. And one thing that I found a bit comical about it was the fact that when these snakes were, despite them sharing a stomach, when these snakes were either feeding or drinking, the owner actually had to put a little wedge of cardboard in between their two heads. Otherwise, the snakes would then bicker over their food and water. Because, of course, they both have their own individual personalities, because they both have their own brains.
And snakes aren't that social.
Snakes aren't that social. But in the calf, how did that work? Because, of course, in the human, they were both humans, so they weren't exactly going to fight over a hamburger, were they? Unless you're a character on a Monty Python sketch.
Well, there was it was in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where one of the Knights of the Round Table was on a quest, and they came across this three-headed knight, and they were threatening him with death, but then they got distracted and started arguing about who wanted to kill him, and then they argued about brushing the middle one's teeth, and at that point they realised, oh, he's buggered off.
So the calf heads argue, do you know, or were they just kind of chilling out? Like,
I think because it was a cow is already a social creature, they were fine with each other. They may have been worried about personal space and maybe knocked each other a few times, but they just sort of eat grass all day and socialise like with other cows.
Fair enough. So one thing we were struggling with was actually finding a benefit to having two heads. The best we could think of was, you said something along the lines of spending less time eating because they share the same stomach but with two mouths.
Yes, simply spending less time. You've got twice as much food intake to the same stomach, so you spend half as much time eating, and you can get more prey.
So there is that, but the main issue was, because of this snake that we saw, we were wondering how we were going to try and avoid the heads arguing. But actually, within that conversation, we've kind of answered our own question, haven't we? In which we just have to make sure it's not a solitary creature.
Yes.
Mate, so possibly Hydras live together or something like that.
Imagine that, a herd of Hydra.
Oh god, that would have made the trial of Heracles distinctly. He finally beats one, and
the other one attacks
then its
him.
mates turn up. So now it's simply a case of talking about regeneration. Now, before we start talking about animals that can regenerate, why don't we talk about in itself how... Because I've seen various images of stuff like an ear grown on a mouse.
Yes.
And that's all to do with stem cells, isn't it? Now,
yes.
I only know... I have a very, very limited knowledge of stem cells. My knowledge is limited to the benefits of neurological science and stem cells, because my dad had MMD, and one of the cures they were looking into, and one of the cures that the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge happened a couple of years ago is funding, is into stem cell research into nervous repair. But I don't know all that much about... I know they've got the ability to become any cell, but do you want to explain a little bit more about what stem cells are and how they've been used to like grow human body parts in the past?
Yes, so basically a stem cell is a cell that has the capacity to become any other kind of cell. The places that you're most likely to find them in a human are in the bone marrow, but also in umbilical cords, hence why they're so useful in growing babies.
And in fetuses, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's one of the ethical issues about growing stem cells, because people say, oh, why not use aborted fetuses?
And then, but at the same,
it's a bit shady.
It's very touchy because of the whole. It all depends on you. We're not going to get into that because we don't want to turn this into a political debate. But basically, that's a debate that's going on in the scientific community at the moment. Is whether it's ethically just to do that. But umbilical cords and bone marrow are both places where we can get them already. So they have the ability to become any kind of cell then.
Pretty much.
And how do scientists tend to induce this in order to grow like specific parts?
I'm no expert on this, but as best I understand it, they insert these stem cells into the mouse, but these are stem cells that have been given the genes of the human ear.
Okay.
So it's sort of in the same way that we have in vitro fertilization, whereby an egg is fertilized
outside the mother.
Outside the mother, using the genetic component from the father instead of the usual way of making babies.
Yeah, of course. So effectively what they can do is they can take these like template cells.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly from my A-level biology, which I did terribly in, so while I'm hosting a science podcast right now.
I did terribly in biology.
Yeah, but now you're doing animal biology, so you at least know something. I'm doing teaching. But in terms of, if I remember correctly, there are certain like enzymes that you can use to like cut out segments of DNA.
Yes, there are enzymes. These
restriction enzymes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and DNA helicases and that sort of thing.
So do they use a similar thing to that, to like take a thing in like the template of an ear and kind of stick it in a load of stem cells, or am I thinking about this completely the wrong way?
Well, I'm not an expert, but I think that might be a way of doing it. I'm really not sure.
Oh, so this, I think you're hearing it now, folks. The first time we've been stumped on our own podcast.
As a special feature, we will do the experiment in reality on mice.
Oh yeah, for sure. So anyway, basically, bottom line is you have these template cells which you can then give the information to allow them to grow into other specific kinds of cells, and you can then do that out like on mice or just in agar plates, for example. Like I know that's how they were doing the nerves.
Yeah.
So with these worms, is it a stem cell thing that allows them to regrow the heart of their head?
I don't think it is. This is just because they have very few differentiated cells, as it is.
Oh, so is it just a case of the fact that they're so simple. Such simple creatures that their cells have so little difference anyway that it basically just heals up in the same way a cut would heal up. But because they're so simplistic, it effectively makes it as good as new. Whereas we are pretty complex, so we have like scar tissue and stuff like that. Okay, that makes sense. But there are some animals that do use stem cells to regrow, aren't there?
Yes.
And I think, before we get into them and how we would incorporate them into a Hydra, we should possibly take a little break and just figure out how wrong we just were. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll be right back after this break.
It's now the Monster Mash.
The Monster Mash.
And it's a graveyard smash.
It's now the mash.
It's caught on in a flash.
It's now the mash.
Hello and welcome back to Joel and Josh's Amazing Creatures, where today we have been talking about Hydra. And so far we've covered things like platyhelminth worms and stem cells and using them to grow ears on mice, something about which we were slightly wrong.
In fact, we were very wrong. They were not actually taking segments of DNA using specific enzymes. In fact, what they were doing is they were putting stem cells in certain cultures and environments and introducing signals to them to basically trying to induce them into changing in a similar way to what would happen in the body. So then they wanted a muscle tissue, they would put it in a certain environment and send it certain signals that would make it think, hey, I need to become muscle. If they wanted a bone tissue, they would put it in a different environment and send it different signals and all across the spectrum in order to grow stuff. So now we've talked about a bit about regeneration and how we can grow things, and a bit about a creature that can in fact regrow its head. We mentioned before the break that there are in fact other creatures known for their regenerative powers that could actually be more Hydra-esque than a big worm. So why don't we talk about them for a little bit?
This is perhaps one of the most amazing vertebrates there are. One of my favourite animals, certainly. Axolotls.
So axolotls, am I correct in thinking that an axolotl is essentially a salamander tadpole?
Kind of. They're bigger than most salamanders, but there is this weird phenomena where when injected with iodine, they will mutate into a salamander.
So
It's an undifferentiated salamander.
okay, so I was always under the impression that effectively salamander eggs would hatch into axolotls, and then if an axolotl left the water, it would turn into a salamander. It would like lose the gills, etc. But unlike other tadpoles, it had the possibility of just stay in the water and stay as a salamander. But you were saying about injecting iodine?
It's a scientists get bored, okay?
So well, they must have some thinking behind it, not just I'm bored, I'm going to stick a needle in this salamander and see what happens. If so, we should do that more, because then we could have like the idea of, oh yeah, did you know if you put chlorine in a gerbil, it turns into a tiger? So why is that? Why do they turn into salamanders when they're injected in iodine?
Because they're so closely related to other salamander species that this iodine, for some reason, it just signals to the stem cells, as you were mentioning earlier, how you have stem cells around muscle cells and it becomes a muscle cell. That just sort of signals to all of the stem cells, oh, time to be a salamander.
Ah, okay. And now we're bringing salamanders up because of their regenerative powers. Like, well, what exactly can they do?
Well, an axolotl is pretty much almost entirely made up of stem cells. So if I were to chop the leg off an axolotl, it would grow back.
So how can a being exist entirely made out of stem cells? Like, I thought cells needed to be specialised in order for us to function.
It's more sort of the organisation of these undifferentiated cells. That's where they get the distinctive pale colour. I mean, some salamanders are sort of mottled grey and look quite like mud puppies, but classically speaking, an axolotl is this bizarre white, and that is sort of the shade of stem cells, and it's very uniform, and it's just organised and compacted so well around a central nervous system, which I don't think is made up of stem cells. Those are specialised cells. So there are some specialised cells in axolotls. They've got eyes and other such things.
So effectively, axolotls are like a big mess of stem cells, and well, not a big mess, like a bag of
A
stem
big
cells.
organisation of stem cells working very well together.
But that means that if something like a limb is chopped off, they can grow it back pretty much perfectly, can't they?
Yes, and in fact, if you kill an axolotl, I can't remember quite how, I think probably gassing or maybe breaking its neck. I might be going on a limb here. But when you open them up after killing them, the heart will still be beating for at least an hour.
Oh wow, but they can't survive having their head chopped off, can they?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So, unlike this worm that you mentioned earlier, despite having this amazing ability to regrow limbs, and how quickly can they regrow limbs?
A while, but say we're looking around a few weeks, maybe a month. Probably a bit more than a month. 2 months max.
Okay. But they can't regrow their head because that's where their brain is and they need that to breathe and eat and that. Has there been any, so you were saying about 2 months. For a Hydra, regrowing something taking 2 months, I feel like that would have made the trial of Heracles distinctly easier because the whole thing was he lopped its head off and suddenly there were 2 others and he had to cauterize the wounds with a torch. Is there any chance that we could accelerate this stem cell reproduction in order to make it go faster? Is there any cases like this?
If we gave it these enormous reserves, I don't think we could make it go and have it occur within less than a minute. But if it had such powerful fat reserves, I mean, lizards preserve fat in their tails. That's why sometimes you see leopard geckos with these stupidly wide tails.
Okay.
But of course, not just fat, things like protein and other such things, and of course, other stem cells. But maybe it's possible. Maybe not growing 2 heads, but at least growing 1 head back.
So effectively, if it reserved enough stem cells in the back, similar to like lizards reserving fat, it might be able to do it very quick. Well, at least try and do. Well, in the end, there are always going to be limitations on what we do here because we're trying to make it as realistic as possible. So we might not have it like being this instant regrowth, which is a shame. But in order to make it feasible, we can't exactly do that. But it can regrow heads, and there is examples of. Axolotl is not a lizard, is it? It's an amphibian.
It is an amphibian. Yeah.
It's an amphibian, but it's got gills, does it not?
Yes, I mean, actually, obviously, a tadpole has gills, but of course, an adult frog doesn't have gills, but it breathes underwater.
Can a frog breathe underwater?
Yes, because they breathe through their skin.
Okay, so we are not going to make our Hydra a lizard.
We're going to make an amphibian.
Rather, we're going to make an amphibian. I like that. I do actually quite like that. So there are other examples that jump into my mind of stuff that can regrow limbs. One of them is a starfish.
Yes.
Do they do it in a similar manner, do you know? Or
I don't think it's that similar to an axolotl, because, and again, it's not all starfish species. Don't go to the seaside and mutilate any starfish you see.
yeah. Hashtag not all starfish.
But they can have a limb removed, and that will slowly regrow into a full starfish, like with platyhelminth worms, not earthworms. Again, don't go into the garden and hack up worms.
Okay, so wait, so I knew 2 things about starfish. I knew if you, like, certain starfish, if you chopped off a limb, it would continue to wiggle out, get food, and bring it back to the original body.
Yeah.
Because starfish have this weird thing where some of their brain is in there.
Yeah, because they have a distributed intelligence rather than a central centre like we do.
And I was under the impression that eventually a new limb would go back to replace it. Now, did I mishear you there and say like a new starfish will grow from the limb?
Very rarely in a few species.
Ah, that's very interesting. The way I was going with this was there's been a lot of cases where starfish will have a limb lopped off, but instead of 1 limb growing back on its place, 2 do, due to a genetic malfunction. Now, that doesn't cause many issues with starfish because, of course, they've got like a multitude of limbs, and in fact, like you said, sometimes a new starfish will grow from a limb. But what I was thinking is if we had effectively these kind of giant axolotls that had like these massive reserves of stem cells ready to go at any moment, because because if we're gonna have multiple heads that don't argue, we're gonna make them social, and socialization, as humans have proved, socialization leads to fighting.
Yeah.
So it's possible that they had these big reserves of stem cells in order to deal with the fights that happen, for example, over territory or mates or stuff like that. So what I was thinking was possibly, because of these huge reserves and the quick regrowth, there could be a lot more room for fuck-ups, effectively, when regrowing limbs and heads. And that could lead to multiple heads regrowing out of a head hole.
Possibly, yes.
Possibly, yes. Or even, like, a more likely occurrence of, you chop off a Hydra's head, and a new Hydra could grow out of that head, as well as possibly a new head.
It might be stretching it a bit.
Might be stretching it, because what I was thinking there is, if we're not going to be able to have maybe 2 heads grow from 1 wound...
Have another grow from the surviving head.
Have 2 Hydras grow from 1 wound.
So that a total of 4 heads by the end.
Well, more so like a total of 2, because what I was thinking of it, in fact, I didn't really think of this, so I might be this might be getting, like I said, a bit too far here.
Okay.
But you were saying about starfish having their limbs, a new starfish grow from their limb.
If it's sort of connected to sufficient amounts of the body.
Ah, okay.
So like if a bit of body chunk gets taken away.
And also the fact that they don't have centralized intelligence, more distributed. So, okay, so that won't really be able to happen. A new Hydra won't be able to grow from a head. Okay, well, regardless, in theory, we basically have a giant axolotl at the moment with the possibility of growing extra heads.
Yes.
That's not quite as Hydra-y as we were hoping, was it? So the only thing left to think about, really, is we have, like, the Hydras are fairly easy. Unlike the other creatures it's done, we don't really have to worry much about aesthetics, because the Hydra's just a big lizard with lots of heads. Possibly long necks, but that's easy enough to do. We have the regenerative powers down. We just need to think of ways it would be able to grow a new head, and also having 2. And I've only got one other solution.
What's that?
Butt brains.
Butt brains.
similar to the butt brain, I might be talking up my arse. But in certain dinosaur species, they had a version of distributed intelligence, didn't they?
Well, it wasn't really a brain in the butt. So take either Stegosaurus or one of the large sauropods. Now, Stegosaurus had a brain the size of a walnut. Sauropods had very small brains, but they were enormous, and that's the ones that people normally talk about with butt brains. And basically, it wasn't a true brain. It didn't have a separate brain for the tail. It was more like a specialized organ for boosting brain signals to the end, because they were so long.
Okay. And my only other one I was thinking about was the chickens that had their head lopped off and still managed to survive.
Yes, there was one, I think, survived for a few months in America, and it went on tour.
How did it... It went on tour?
Yeah, it went on tour.
So how did it manage to survive without a head for so long?
Well, because there was a little bit of brainstem still attached via the neck, and of course then you've got the problem of the chicken starving to death. Well,
It was fed through a pipette, wasn't it?
It was fed through a pipette down the neck hole. And it only died because the owner forgot to feed it one day.
Oh, Jesus Christ. How do you forget to feed your famous chicken? So
while on tour as well.
While on tour. So could we combine this idea of a little bit of brainstem, a little bit of butt brain, and in theory give it enough of a defining nervous system to allow it to survive long enough without a head?
I suppose that's possible.
Because if it's one thing with big reptiles, I'm not sure if this applies to amphibians, is they don't need to eat super often
because they're cold-blooded.
Because they're cold-blooded and fat reserves and stuff like that. So if you've got these big fat and stem cell reserves, in theory, if it is recently eaten and it has this kind of like enhanced central nervous system which gives it like an almost, not a secondary brain, but enough to keep it functioning for a while, it could in theory have its head lopped off and regrow it.
Yes, you mentioned slow metabolisms. In zoos, do you know how often they really need to feed a crocodile?
No.
About one chicken a week.
Oh wow.
That's it.
That's it.
I mean, you can feed them more, and they'll be happy to oblige. I mean, I was once at a college where the caiman were fed a rat a day, possibly every 2 days.
So yeah, well, that's pretty good then. If we
and if it's in an even colder environment, then it won't need to feed as much even then.
Well, an even colder environment. Axolotls are aquatic,
yes,
aren't they? And if I remember the myth correctly, Heracles initially fought this Hydra in a cave. So if we have like almost like underground water systems with caves and stuff like that, which are a common thing in the world.
Yeah, there's this massive, extensive network of underwater caves across Europe, and inside them is a relative of the axolotl. Now, not much is known about this. We've not actually done as much stem cell experimentation on them as we have the axolotl because they're just so hard to find. It's called the olm, and they look so bizarre. So you know what an axolotl looks like.
I do.
Well, imagine that, but like a really thin tube. And the arms are even thinner than my spindly fingers. Like, imagine if my fingers were like my arms.
So like spaghetti axolotls.
Spaghetti axolotls, basically.
There needs to be more spaghetti versions of animals. Like giraffes are like spaghetti horses. Yeah. So effectively that would function as a really good environment for this kind of thing. Although we're not having like a burly man lopping off heads only for two to sprout back, we do have a creature here which has the ability to regrow its heads, and if it's doing it in quite a rush, possibly freak out its genetics a bit and grow too.
Yeah.
And while this might not have any particular evolutionary benefit, there's already recorded instances of creatures accidentally growing two heads already, and in social species like cows, it's not proved that much of an issue, really. So is there any other issues that have really come up with this, or?
Apart from bickering and rivalry, not so much. In fact, if there were to be one of these Hydra born with two heads, it's perfectly possible that they could survive throughout adulthood and maybe have the head regrowing two more back again, but let's not focus on that at the moment.
What's the worst case scenario? The Hydra bites its other head off? What's going to happen? It's just going to regrow. Honestly, I think that's pretty much about as close as we are going to get, really.
A big axolotl. Not necessarily even that dangerous, just a big axolotl with two heads.
So, there we have it. We have essentially taken a creature that's really alive today and made it huge. Although we have maybe made some aesthetic changes, making it a long neck, maybe.
Yeah.
Which possibly could root into those olms which are spaghetti axolotls, but Yeah, we've talked a lot about the regenerative powers of a lot of animals we have today, security bees, and the future of medicine using axolotls and stem cells. So all in all, despite this not being maybe our most fantastic creature, it's been a rather interesting episode.
Yes, it has.
And you know what, Joel? For the first time on this programme, I feel like if we came across one of these,
we might not die.
So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and let's not play God.